Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Do you want to play casual and esports games at 1 to 200 frames per second, high to ultra detail at 1080p without spending a fortune? This is the computer you should take a look at. $900 buys you a pre-built gaming desktop with an i5-8400 6-core 6-thread CPU, 8GB of system RAM, 120GB SSD, 1TB hard drive, and an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1060 3GB graphics card. For $900, this is a very reasonably priced pre-built machine built out of industry standard parts. I've covered it before. Links to that full playlist in the video description below. Far more details including a complete overview of this machine. But this video is we're testing 5 esports titles: Overwatch, League of Legends, Heroes of the Storm, World of Tanks, and World of Warships. We're playing all of these games at 1080p at max detail. I'm going to show you 1 minute of gameplay in each of the 5 games. Not built-in benchmarks, this is actual live gameplay, and what you're going to watch is what the gameplay footage was used for the benchmark results. Then I'm going to show you the charts, both average, 1% low, and 0.1% low, and then we're going to talk about how great this machine is. I mentioned there'll be a link in the description below to the full playlist of videos on this computer. I've already done a video testing AAA games. I've done a video comparing this to a 3rd generation i5, and then the first video where I actually take it apart, show you the inside, the back of it, etc. Go check those out if you're interested. Also linked in the description below will be the link to Amazon.com, where I bought this machine, and so should you if you want the best deal in a gaming desktop available today. I really do like this machine. It was not a product sample sent to me by CyberPower. I bought this. It's very, very nice. There's also another version of the machine down there for $200 more. I won't go into too much detail because I did that in the AAA game benchmark video, but in short, 16 gigs of RAM and the i7-8700 CPU for $200 more. If you're playing AAA games, Battlefield 1, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Call of Duty World War II, get the i7 version of the machine. The extra $200 is totally worth it for that. But if you're playing Overwatch, League of Legends, Dota 2, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, you don't need that at all. This is plenty. And frankly, this is plenty if you're doing high refresh rate gaming, if you want 1 to 200 frames per second. If you're happy with high detail at 1080p at 60 frames per second, believe it or not, for those games, even this is overkill. There are less expensive ways to go about playing those games. You don't have to go this far. In fact, in the video description below, the previous generation machine, the i5-3400 with the GTX 1060 dropped into it, would actually play those games just fine. But this does give you some future proofing to play games for many years to come, and if those are the kinds of games you play, this will easily give you 3 to 5 years of performance with no upgrades whatsoever required. One quick note before we get to the benchmarks: notice the red LED lights? This computer is turned on. Now, I didn't get to mention this verbally in the AAA game benchmark video of this machine, but I'll go ahead and say it now. Can you hear it? The microphone is right here over my head. I basically have an overhead boom microphone. The computer is on less than 12 inches away from me. It's pretty quiet, isn't it? It's not 100% silent. I can hear that it's on, but it's real quiet. If you were to put this under your desk, it would be silent. The desk would completely muffle any sound from this. So if you're concerned about noise in any regard, there basically is none. Anyway, on to the benchmarks. The first game we're showing you today is Heroes of the Storm. This is a free-to-play game from Blizzard, and it is way too much fun. Notice the character I'm playing. For those of you who have watched my channel for a while, you know I'm happy to be benchmarking this now that we've got D.Va in here. D.Va is my main in Overwatch, for those of you who don't know. We'll see her again in a few minutes in Overwatch. In any case, look at the performance in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. We're over 200 frames per second. Now, it doesn't stay over 200 all the time, but we are running at ultra detail. The graphics card is not 100% utilized. The graphics card is only 50 to 70% used. The limitation to performance here is actually the CPU. And I know some people are going to say, well, how can the CPU be the limit? The CPU is only at 22, 25%. That's correct, because this game does not use 6 cores or 6 threads. Not all games do. And this is a perfect example of how a 5, 6, 7-year-old computer with 2 to 4 cores would actually play this game just fine. A GTX 1050 would play it just fine. And speaking of playing things just fine, League of Legends is also just fine. We are using slightly more CPU here, about 30%, but we're using even less graphics card. Notice the frame rate is over 200, there's 240 frames per second, no issues whatsoever. Now I'm showing you these games not because there should have ever been a doubt as to how well they'd run, but it does tell you just how well they will run and how little of the computer they're actually using. You can essentially play these games indefinitely going forward many years, and similar type games will be no issue whatsoever. Notice our main system RAM usage at about 4.5 gigabytes. 8 gigs of RAM is plenty for esports games. It's AAA games that you need more RAM for, but for these kind of games, 16 gigs really is unnecessary. Even with all this action on the screen, take a look at the frame rate. We're still over 130 frames per second. Amazing performance. Now we're going to switch to Overwatch. Overwatch is incredible on this machine, and Overwatch is set to ultra detail. I genuinely was surprised. I was expecting to run this. This would not run as well as it does. Now notice that the CPU usage is above 66%. Overwatch is really the only game here that will use more than 4 threads or 4 cores. It will use up to 6 at times. But given the nature of the game, you should be fine on a 6-core, 6-thread CPU for a long time, certainly within the lifespan of a machine like this in the next 5 years or so. Of all the games tested today that you might want to put more memory into the system, maybe this is the one. We're just over 6 gigabytes of RAM. Yes, with 8 gigabytes of RAM, it does technically fit. But of course, this is a clean test machine. There's nothing else running on it. No web browsers, no installed programs, absolutely nothing. So a used computer that's 6 months old that you've downloaded and installed programs on will probably use a little bit more RAM than that, just for full disclosure to let you know that. Now moving on to World of Tanks. This game definitely does not need more RAM. We are at maximum detail. We have full screen anti-aliasing turned on. We're over 150 frames per second. And wow, we're not even to 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now the graphics card is fully utilized, but the CPU is hardly. We're using 2-ish, maybe 3 cores at the most. So certainly this machine is extreme overkill. Now some people watching this might say, wait a minute, how are you getting 180 frames per second in World of Tanks? Isn't that game limited to 120? Yes it is, but there's a World of Tanks tool that you can download that will let you edit the engine config.xml file and lift that restriction. I actually have it set to a maximum of 250 frames per second in the game, but normally the game is actually limited to 120. So if you play this game and it won't go over 120, that's why. We have the same situation with the next game, World of Warships. World of Warships also has a frame limiter, but it is limited to 75 frames per second. Again, you can see here we are comfortably over that. Now, the engine config XML file is not encrypted. You don't need a tool. You can actually edit it in a normal text editor. In this case, I've changed it to 250 frames per second, and it's just fine. Notice that World of Warships uses more main system RAM than World of Tanks did, but not tremendously so. It's still about 5 gigabytes. It would be fine at 8 gigabytes on this system. We are at very high detail. Full screen anti-aliasing is turned up to high. Every detail setting is basically set to the very high setting, to the max. And there's no issues whatsoever. We're 120 frames per second. It's great performance. This computer is amazing. For these kinds of games, you absolutely don't need an i7. You don't need a 1070, 1080. A $900 machine with a 6-core processor and a GTX 1060 will last you for a long time. The first chart we're going to look at is the average frame rate of these 5 games: 172, 211, 147, 164, and 133. All of these games were over 130 frames per second. If you have a 1080p 144Hz monitor and you want to play games at high refresh rate, you don't need a top-of-the-line machine. This mid-level machine for under $1,000 will do these kinds of games and many other similar ones at 144 frames per second or better the vast majority of the time, even at ultra detail. I didn't specifically test it, but if you want to play at 1440p, this machine will do just fine as well. Now, you're not going to get 211 frames per second all of the time, but actually, most of these games will still run 100 to 144 frames per second, even at ultra detail, even at 1440p. So, if you've got a higher resolution monitor, this is still a great machine for these kinds of games. Now we're going to take a look at the 1% low numbers. The 1% low represents the minimum frame rate that it gets down to 1% of the time. 99% of the time your frame rate is higher than this. It's not a true minimum, but it's close to it. I have colored these green because I consider this to be the true playable minimum. All of these games get at least 60 frames per second. Frankly, Heroes of the Storm is only at 77. I benchmarked the full run. When the character dies and you teleport back to base or your Hearthstone back to base, the truth of the matter is that's where those dips are. The game was incredibly well performing. There really was no 77 frames per second in the playable. That's a little deceptive in that regard. Same thing of World of Warships right at the end when you die and there's a huge explosion that tends to drag the number down. Frankly, these games play very, very well. These are the 0.1% numbers. 99.9% of the time, your frame rate will be this or better. I don't really worry about these numbers personally. This is a mere few seconds worth of gameplay in 10 minutes of gaming. It is next to nothing. You'll never notice it. These are usually just a scene transition or a loading screen or teleporting back to base, and there's just a couple of frames in it that drag it down. You do that a couple times during a run, and boom, you've got a lower frame rate. This is why I show the actual live gameplay and not benchmark charts. If you look at this chart, some people would look at that 59 and 67 and think, oh, well, I want a high frame rate. Maybe I better buy a more powerful computer. Watch the gameplay. I'm showing you representative performance in the minute of gameplay per game. You do not need more than this computer. It is way over 100 frames per second all the time it's playable. Well, there you have it. 5 casual and esports titles tested over 100 frames per second. This thing is wonderful. Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Dota 2, and any of the other types of games in that caliber. Even though I didn't test them here, they will run very, very well at hundreds of frames per second on this machine. If those are what you want to play, you don't need to spend a penny more than this to get incredible performance. And as I said before, that will be true for the next 3 to 5 years without an issue. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section, and as always, check out the links in the video description. The full playlist of this thing will be down there. The links to Amazon.com for both this and the $1,100 version, those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. If you found this helpful, useful, interesting, or just entertaining, please use those when shopping. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video.